Well, I would assume that my advice would be to combine my modest comments with the very wise comments of Mr. Kelamis, and then maybe one would get a balanced account, because although he did express sympathy for his fellow geopoliticians, I would express my empathy to the geoeconomists, but would claim that above all governs the notion of history, and it is a profound look into our history in a place no less than Delphi that one should look at those things. And in a way, it would be the converse of a sense of optimism that is driving everybody into perhaps very high hopes, and hopes should be much more modest. Because, as you see, the previous session ended with this expectation by a gentleman that we should have prayers. And yes, of course, prayers are always very good. But then it occurred to me that if we were to have the right balance of prayers to allow for the kind of development that we need here, we would have to have not only Christian clergy, but we would have to have Muslim clergy, and we would have to have Jewish clergy, and that becomes slightly more complicated. Now, it is true that somebody had said in our history that if only Jews and Arabs were to act toward each other with a good Christian spirit, things would have been so much better. Trouble is that they don't. And so the regional and international relationships, even those which are economic in nature or energy related or financial, are marred by political disputes and divisions, some of which are a division of positions in the issue itself. For example, disputes over rights and disputes over privileges. But others are external to the issue, but govern. And let me give you a very modest and banal truism. In the world, the economic forces are powerful, but political forces are stronger. And in the world, political forces are strong, but religious forces are even stronger. And that's a bad omen, because so much of our politics is all too often shrouded in kind of religious intensities, and that complicates things even further. Just to give you an example, we've been talking about Egypt, but Egypt has recently oscillated between a more Islamic type of a regime and a more nationalistic type of a regime, and things did reflect themselves in certain positions. So you don't even know where things stand. Let's just take a very quick overview of the parties involved in everything when we talk about the Eastern Mediterranean. Well, Lebanon used to be considered a quiet country that was reasonable in expectation of making a good economic deal and so forth. Now, today, even we Israelis have suddenly developed a dispute over territorial and economic rights, and that is a dispute that at the moment could have been resolved diplomatically through arbitration or through some diplomatic involvement, be it of the US. The trouble is that Lebanon is not exactly the Lebanon one would like to have at the table. In Lebanon, we have the Hezbollah. Now, the Hezbollah not only take a more religiously led position, but it started to make all kind of ominous threats that it would be in a position to target Israeli energy facilities. Now, that's a tricky one, because they are right. Those facilities are vulnerable. And what do we notice in the meantime? While everybody is looking into the process of tenders and exploration and reliance on those very promising figures, we see also bonanza when it comes to a naval buildup. Suddenly everybody is purchasing boats and frigates, and Israelis themselves claim that some of our future acquisitions are to be intended to defend the oil rigs or the gas facilities. And suddenly we're talking about drones that will do the matter, and we have a little arms race that is now tailing the energy race. And that's a problem, because things could get wrong Indeed, if you've been watching the situation in Israel's north, things are not quiet on the northern front. We have not only the Hezbollah with 130,000 missiles potentially targeted at Israeli targets, but we have Syria, and what a sad story Syria is. Syria is, of course, implicated in everything, including the Eastern Mediterranean. But in Syria, we see a civil war which is amazingly destructive, which indicates to you that when people fight even their own kin, they are capable of doing incredible suffering and destruction, which could, at one point, be also targeted not only at religious facilities, but also at economic and energy-related facilities. Look at Syria. Now, with Syria, we have the problem that it also has its own interest, but in that theater, we suddenly have a major new actor, and that is, of course, in fact, two. We have Russia, which has its own interest when it comes to supplies of energy to Europe, and they do take an interest. I've been in contact with them at the highest levels, and I'll tell you they are very keen on looking at their position in the Eastern Mediterranean as a derivative of their interest on energy exportation and transportation to Europe. And they are not beyond using all kind of tricks that they possess. So they have leverage. They have leverage also on the security aspect. But then they become implicated in this situation because there is yet another party which has arrived at the shores of the Mediterranean, or nearly so, and that is Iran. Now, Iran agenda is sometimes also led by energy and exportation considerations, which are also very complicated and go beyond the Eastern Mediterranean context. But also Iran is very much politically, I wouldn't say religiously, but politically led into taking high-risk steps in Syria, which could instigate some kind of friction with Israel. And this is becoming an explosive part of the world. All this must project onto the theater itself. So we have all these countries involved in this. I do not even mention the Palestinians that also have a gas field that they would like to see developed and is paralyzed at the moment. And we have then the Egyptians, whose position has been mentioned already. Egypt, luckily, is on a different side of some of the issues. At the moment, Israel has signed an agreement to have its liquefaction of gas done through Egyptian facilities to be exported to Europe. I don't know how this will affect other options which are related to Cyprus or possibly Israel itself. Now, liquefaction is in many, many ways a security hazard and a safety hazard and a highly expensive, and of course it ties in with the policies of the exportation of gas beyond the region itself. So Egyptian considerations. Relative to Turkey, in short, we are just touching on the tip of the iceberg of the very powerful geopolitical and geostrategic consideration, which are very complicated, the possibilities, and therefore are likely to attenuate the ability either to strike very ambitious deals or to have them stand viable, and it would reflect itself also in the propensity of companies investing and even states investing. Now, we in the Middle East, certainly even in Israel, have also a history of knowing what sabotage looks like. Let me tell you that the very early sabotage was of the Iraqi pipelines that led from Iraq to the refineries in Haifa almost 80 years ago. That's how the Israeli self-defense forces came all about. But we've seen sabotage of the pipelines going through Egypt, through the Sinai. That's a very sad and pathetic story that led to multi-billion litigation between us and Egypt, and that becomes a part of the history. These are not just worst case scenarios that have to be contemplated, but real life events that took place and might take place also in the future. Now, what is all this to suggest? It is not that we should not seek to advance the possibility and the prospects that we have, but to be very, very cognizant that this is an extraordinarily complicated part of the world, torn by too many political, military, religious antagonisms, in which often the energy policies are subject to political considerations rather than the other way around. And therefore, the approach taken to developing the needs that exist ought to be done, as the title of this panel calls for, with a sense of pragmatism and realism, with a gradual way, with a very cautious approach, and in fact, prudence should be the order of the day and not inflated hopes that are likely to end up with frustration and even losses. And that is the worst that can happen in economic life, strict losses. Thank you.